Good afternoon to you once again from the sports desk. So local cricket fans look set to suffer from the latest sport broadcast rights standoff. Now the SABC and rights holder Multichoice have not reached an agreement for the Cricket World Cup. This means that the Proteas' quest for a maiden ODI World Cup title will only be on pay channel SuperSport. The numbers and regulations behind TV sport rights have become a complicated issue over the years, and to help simplify it somewhat, cash and sport research company founder Nqobile Ndlovu joins us live to talk to us about this. Nqobile, thank you so much for your time, brother. So just tell us, why are sporting rights in South Africa such a complicated matter, and why do we find ourselves in this situation right now with the SABC, the Proteas and Multichoice?
Dako, thanks for having me. The sports right issue is quite complicated in that South Africa doesn't have a paradigm where a rights holder, which would be the sporting team or the federation, is restricted in terms of who they can sell the rights to. And the people who would be trying to buy the rights, and I'm trying to simplify this as best as I can, the people who would be trying to buy the rights of the broadcaster, which would either be a pay TV broadcaster, which is SuperSport, or the free-to-air broadcasters, which would be eMedia and the SABC. Generally, until the 90s, the SABC held almost all sporting rights in this country, which were either free-to-air or pay TV. And then when SuperSport started buying up the rights, the sporting federations and the teams themselves preferred to sell all the rights to SuperSport because exclusivity, which is when a broadcaster buys both free-to-air and pay TV, the exclusivity element guarantees more money. If you have the rights split, it dilutes the value because the assumption is that a pay TV broadcaster can't pay as much as a free-to-air broadcaster, and therefore the price would come down. So the broadcasters and the rights holders have essentially agreed exclusive rights across the board for rugby, cricket, and football, which are our major sports, and that's the reason why we find ourselves in this debacle where the broadcasters who would be the SABC, who are free-to-air broadcasters, have to then go to Multichoice to essentially sub-license the rights and pay for the rights in order to broadcast them on free-to-air, even though they are free-to-air broadcaster and Multichoice is not.
Yeah. So all in all, Nqobile, money remains central to getting these broadcast rights, like the ones for the Cricket World Cup, essentially.
Correct. Just because a broadcaster is a free-to-air broadcaster and they want to get the rights, it's not free to acquire. They have to pay a fair price for those rights. So, for example, SuperSport or Multichoice spends over 2 billion rand annually on rights. When they sub-license those rights or sell them onto someone else, they charge a fee, and that's been the contention. Because the SABC has been unable to most of the time afford that sub-license fee, they've gone without the rights. So essentially, money is central, and the rights holders, which is the sports teams and federations, need this money in order to operate. So the money goes from the broadcaster to the rights holder in order for them to operate their expenses, and then the broadcaster gets their money back through selling advertising during games.
Yeah. But besides the money, Nqobile, does our legislation need to change in order for tournaments like this one to be on the public broadcaster?
It's been a contentious issue with regards to legislation. ICASA tried to intervene on this issue back in 2019. There were ICASA hearings. And essentially what came out of it, to summarize it for the layman, essentially ICASA then said, we will have 3 categories of sport of national interest. The highest categories include rugby, cricket, football, and some other sports. So what they decided ultimately was to say, we can't force the broadcasters and the sports federations to come into the table and come to an agreement which forces free-to-air television to have all the sports. But we will encourage the broadcasters amongst themselves to come to an agreement which is fair for both sides. What that looks like, they didn't really clarify. So what's gone on in the meantime is that it's continued essentially being the same status quo, which is Multichoice holds the rights, the SABC has to go to Multichoice, Multichoice determines what they think a fair price is, and the SABC can't afford it. So potentially what could happen, and there are two court cases and there are two issues currently going on. The Competition Commission is looking at this from a competition's point of view to say, can a free-to-air broadcaster have pay TV rights and vice versa? And the other side is that e-media has also taken Multichoice to court in alleging, an unfair advantage or having an unfair, sub-license agreement in that they don't allow for some games to be broadcast on some channels. So it could potentially change in the near future, but not any time before the end of the year when the Competition Commission is expected to come back with the ruling.
Yeah, but there were interventions which helped the SABC obtain a sub-licensing right for the Rugby World Cup, also just with the Minister of Sports also just getting involved in that debacle. Do you see something similar perhaps happening for the Cricket World Cup? I mean, the tournament starts on Thursday and the Proteas play on Saturday.
Right. So part of that intervention that helped the SABC to acquire those rights were two. There were two types of interventions. The one was that the Minister of Sports, Arts and Culture intervened to say that you guys need to go back to the negotiating table. Initially, SuperSport had agreed to give the SABC 7 games. However, it came out later that SAB, the Brewer, and Hollywood Bets had come together to essentially assist the SABC to pay for the rights. Now, in this instance, with regards to cricket, I'm not sure, and I don't want to speculate. My sources within the industry tell me that the negotiations are still ongoing, despite the statements that came out today. But I'm not too sure that the pressure will be enough and that there will be enough support given to the SABC to allow them to acquire these rights at the last minute. It has happened before and we can't write it off, but it seems a little bit more difficult with cricket than it is for a sport where there's almost a guarantee that the Springboks will get further into the tournament, likely the semi-finals. In cricket, it is possible, you never know. The Proteas haven't had a great time of it over the last few years in terms of tournaments. And it is possible that, funders might think it's not as appealing as a football or a rugby.
Nqobile, thank you so much for joining us, brother. That was Nqobile Ndlovu from Cash and Sports joining us just to unpack this issue around the Proteas as well as the broadcasting rights between the SABC and Multichoice.